Good afternoon, everyone. This is Joanne Stevens, and this is our Thursday call-in show. Today we have a very special guest, Rick Robinson from MHI, and I'll introduce Rick in a few moments. We're going to talk about federal fair housing laws. And before I introduce Rick, I want to remind people of some upcoming events. The first event will be the George Allen Roundtable being held September 6th, 7th, and 8th in Indianapolis. For information about this conference and registration, you may go to my website, joannemstevens.com, and click on Save the Date. Also, in October, SECO, S-E-C-O, a conference in the southeastern United States will take place, and there's information about that on the website. And in November 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, is the MHI National Communities Council conference in Chicago. That's always a very good conference. And finally, December 11th and 12th here in Cedar Rapids, we're going to have an mobile home park owners symposium. And at that event, we'll have accountants talking about capital gains taxes, estate planning, in planning for retirement, and also best practices for operating a mobile home park. At that conference, we'll have a workshop on valuing mobile home parks. So everybody who comes, if they bring some of their financials, they'll leave with a value of what their park is worth in today's market. It is a very dynamic market. So without further ado, I want to introduce Rick Robinson. Rick, are you with us?
I am here, Joanne. Good to talk to you this afternoon.
Yes, good. Thanks for joining us, Rick. And before we get started, I want to tell people a little bit about your background. And Rick is an attorney. He's been involved in.
Don't hold that against me.
Okay. He was a partner in a large law firm in Cincinnati in northern Kentucky, Graydon, Head, and Ritchie law firm. And he has been involved not only in law but government and politics for 30 years. At the law office, he dealt with many financial clients and international manufacturers. And then in 2013, Rick joined MHI, the Manufactured Housing Institute, as a Senior Vice President of State and Regulatory Affairs and General Counsel. And that was there's been a lot happening at MHI in recent years with the Dodd-Frank Act and many other matters. So today we're going to primarily talk about the federal fair housing laws. And Rick, tell us, if you would, a little bit about federal fair housing and some of the common areas that you see people getting into trouble with today.
Well, they are all over the board when it comes to landlord-tenant law, and what we're seeing more and more happening is that they are actually getting into, Joanne, very much into the manufactured housing area. The first thing that I always see and when I talk and meet with folks is that and by the way, I'll be in Iowa for the annual meeting of MHI, for if anybody has any questions, going to be there. But the one thing that I always point out to people first and foremost is people think of fair housing as mainly a federal law. And that's where it came about. I mean, it was the Civil Rights Act of 1968 that said you could not discriminate in any type of housing based upon race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or familial status. And the first problem that you run into is that a lot of folks with their inquiry about what they're doing stop there. They think, okay, that's all I have to deal with. But the fact of the matter is there ends up being a whole bunch of other laws that tie into that, usually on the state and local level, that you got to take a look at too. Iowa has its own human rights law, which adds we call those the protected classes, the classes that we had in those others that we just mentioned. But Iowa adds creed. Now, I'm not sure really what the difference is between creed and religion. I actually tried to look that up, and I haven't figured it out. But Iowa
I don't think anybody else has either.
I always thought maybe it's because the JCs had a creed. I always thought that meant you couldn't discriminate against JCs. So I don't know. But it also includes, Iowa includes sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yes, it does.
In its state law. So, and then if you think that's all the further you have to go, think again. You actually have to go down and start thinking about what are the local jurisdictions that have laws. And if you look in Iowa, I found just in a real quick search this morning, Ames, Cedar Rapids, Council Bluffs, Davenport, Des Moines, Dubuque, Iowa City, Johnson County, Sioux, and Waterloo all have local laws. Now, that's just with a quick search. I bet I could find a couple others if I spent the time looking. So when you're thinking about your policies and the things that you should have in a community and what type of protected classes you have to look at, you can't just stop with the federal. You got to look at those state laws and those local city laws as well.
You know, I think that's a very good point, Rick, because how many people in the housing business, whether it's manufactured housing, multifamily, real estate agents, do you think are aware that it is all those, federal, state, and local laws?
Well, in some places you get, Joanne, and I'm not as familiar with the state structure in Iowa, but I know that a lot of states that I go in and lecture in, when I really start doing the research on local state laws, a lot of times the state enforcement agencies are a lot more rigorous at their enforcement than even the federals are. So sometimes you have to almost worry more about the state agencies than you do the feds.
That's probably the case. And where are there certain areas where you see people getting into, having difficulties where multifamily owners over and over again run into trouble with these laws?
Absolutely. So let's talk for a minute about the things you can't do based upon, once you get together all of your protected classes from your federal and your state and your local, what can't you do based upon a protected class? And I tell people, I always say, if you want to make this easy and not offensive to everybody, think about the old movie Blazing Saddles, where at the end of the movie, one of the guys says, "We don't want the Irish." I say that because that's my people, and I can say that. So you can't go through it. As we go to these things, think about the old Blazing Saddles. We can't do these things because we don't want the Irish.
Okay.
For instance, you can't refuse to rent or sell based upon a class.
Okay.
You can't steer or misrepresent availability. You can't say, "I don't have something here," when I actually do, because we don't want the Irish. You can't refuse to negotiate. You can't make housing unavailable. You can't limit the use of facilities. You can't change terms. You can't advertise in a discriminatory way. You can't fail to make reasonable accommodations or modifications, and you can't threaten or retaliate based upon any of those protected classes. Well, everybody looks at me at that point and goes, well, what the heck can I do then? Well,
right.
what you can do is operate your business. You can set rate at market rates. You can set and uniformly apply rental criteria. You can set and uniformly apply occupancy criteria. You can refuse to rent based on your criteria. Here's one of the cool things, and people don't think about this. You can actually advertise to a protected class. You can actually say,
Okay.
Handicapped accessible clubhouse.
Okay.
There's something where you're actually advertising to a protected class because you want them in. Children's playgrounds.
Okay.
Advertising to a protected class, a family. And you can't evict. You can't evict based upon any of your criteria that you have. So while there seems like there's a lot of restrictions, you can operate your business just as long as you don't do it unfairly towards any of these protected classes.
You know, Rick, one of the things I've heard many park owners say is that they really like having Hispanic residents. I mean, Hispanic residents have generally a reputation that they pay their rent on time, they don't cause problems, they don't have parties where the police get involved. How about advertising in the Spanish language? Would that be a discriminatory practice?
No, in fact, one of the things, we'll talk here in a minute about, one thing I like to do with these, Joanne, is really give some practice pointers so that people, it's not just a legal discussion we're having here, but giving practice pointers. And one of the things I always tell communities when I go in and do my Fair Housing 101 seminar that I do is I tell folks, you know, first thing you need to do is if you have a predominant Hispanic or a predominant Asian community in your area, keep your policies and your procedures on hand in other languages so that you can readily give them to someone that they can read and understand their rights and responsibilities there. And that's one of the things that I would encourage everybody to do. You know, when you look into this whole thing of, you know, compliance and non-compliance and everything else, I mean, the thing I think you have to remember is that, you know, if you want to know what it costs to be non-compliant, don't ask, because I guarantee you that your listeners today cannot afford it. There was a recent case down in Fort Myers, Florida, where a violation, and it was a simple violation at an MH park, a dumb violation by the owner, cost him $60,000 and whatever attorney fees they spent in the process. So it's not something that you want to get into.
Yes, you're right. It is something nobody can afford, that kind of penalty or fine. Rick, you said that you teach a course in federal fair housing. Where is this course available for community owners?
Well, generally what I do is that I'm invited in by the various state associations to come in and talk, and they will want me to come in and talk on various topics. And usually when I come into states where there are a lot of communities, they will ask that I come in and do my Fair Housing 101. Again, it's a 30,000 foot view of what's going on in fair housing, but very, very non-lawyer presentation. A lot of the stuff we're talking about today is included in it. The state will ask me to come in and do that. Now, I am going to be in Iowa for the annual meeting for the association. I haven't talked with Joe yet, though, of Joe Kelly yet, the executive director there, about what I'm speaking on when I come in. Maybe with this being out there, maybe we'll talk about doing the fair housing update to see if we can talk about the things that getting everybody in the room and having a classroom setting where we talk about this.
Yeah, I think that in my career, I've been in the housing business, you know, both manufactured housing and the real estate business for over, you know, pushing 30 years. And it seems like every time I sit through a fair housing class, I'm reminded of things that I've sort of forgotten or things I didn't know. And so I think that, you know, at least an annual refresher is probably a good thing for anybody who works in our industry.
Well, the other thing that I would recommend, and if your listeners are interested in it, the one thing that we provide at MHI, you do not have to be a member of MHI, by the way, to get this, is the Fair Housing Update. The Fair Housing Update is a monthly newsletter that we send out from MHI that gives just a basic 2-page overview on what's happened in the last month of fair housing with regards to the industry. We'll give cases that are happening. We'll give reviews on what's going on. We'll give sample policies that we think communities ought to have. All of that free. All you have to do is send me an email at rrobinson@mfghome.org, and I'll make sure people get on the mailing list. It's something that, again, we keep it in front of everybody every month because we believe that at MHI that fair housing is good housing policy.
It is. Well, that's a tremendous resource. So we'll make sure that we'll put that in the newsletter and get the word out about that, your updates. That's a great thing to do for people in the industry. And those are really well written, and they're written in everyday language, so they're easy to understand.
One of the greatest compliments I've been paid was at one of these events. Somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "Wow, you sure don't talk like a lawyer." And so I thought that was one of the best compliments I'd ever been paid.
Yeah, high praise. And,
well, and in some degree, some of the things that we're talking about, we have to make sure that in doing these things, we don't sound like lawyers. We have to make sure that we're talking to the people who are our residents, who are our tenants that are coming in and living in our homes. I recommend to everybody that every community have at least 4 written policies.
Okay.
And as I tell people, the first policy that you have is a general anti-discrimination policy.
Okay.
And that policy should just list your state, your federal, your local laws, and say, we abide by all of these.
Okay.
And you make that very simple. You make that first policy very simple to read. I tell people, if you have to show it to a lawyer to understand it, tear it up and start over. Because you want the customer walking in the door to understand that this is a community that abides by the letter and the spirit of all state, local, and federal fair housing laws. I encourage people to actually go to the point of taking that policy, put it in a frame, and put it up in their business office, so that people coming in see this when they walk in. But again, it has to be simple to read. We at Rick's Park hereby agree that we hereby want you to know we abide by the federal fair housing law. Stated. The state of Iowa fair housing law, dates and classes, the Des Moines local law. Should you have any questions about this, please feel free to call our management office, give the phone number. Mm-hmm. Make it as simple as possible that they understand what it is.
Okay. And are you saying you recommend that people have that in the form of a handout and to give to people?
I would take the general anti-discrimination policy and put it right up in the front office. And then the one thing that I would do when you give something to people, the one thing that I would give to people is that I would make sure that on my leases that I have language in there that says that basically states that the community is interested in abiding by all fair housing laws. And I would also make sure that the fair housing logo, the little bug, that little house provided at the HUD website, is on my leases as well. I would want those to be there because, interestingly enough, Joanne, is that when HUD comes in and looks at this stuff, they're real proud of that logo.
Okay.
And if they think you don't have that logo on there, they somehow think that you are not as proud of that as they are. And they want to make sure that everything that you do, and that goes not only with your leases, I put it on all my advertisements as well. That's including the ones you put on Craigslist.
Wow.
Rick's community is a fair housing community. Boom, put that bug right next to it.
That's a great idea.
You know, along with the anti-discrimination policy, we also recommend that there are 3 other policies that people ought to have in their files, and that is a reasonable accommodation and modification policy, a policy on a policy on occupancy standards, and a policy on rental screening.
Okay.
Each one of those, having those written and in place, are such that they're going to help you when some of these incidents come up, that you have a policy in place that you're going to follow and you're going to apply across the board, no matter who it is walking in through that door. And so, for instance, the occupancy standard may become a real simple policy, because you may look to the HUD policy on how many people per bedroom, or your local community might also have an occupancy policy in their city code. That would be where I would start. That may be just very simple. If somebody comes in and says, we would like a 1-bedroom and we have 6 people, you can say our occupancy policy based upon this HUD or the city ordinance, our occupancy standard is 2 per person, 3 per person, whatever it is you determine that is, and then say, we're not renting to you based upon that policy standard. Again, it's in writing. It's something we have. We apply it across the board to everybody. Therefore, no matter who walks through that door, to deny based upon that is not discriminatory. Same thing with rental screening. What is it that you're going to screen based upon? Now, a lot of your listeners may use a third party. And because they're using a third party, their screening policy may already be in place. They can pick up the phone and call their third party and have them come in and actually just prepare it for it and send it to them. But I'd have it on file and I'd have it ready. The one thing about the screening policy, a lot of times, if you post that screening policy, it could in fact become a self-determinating factor for people that walk in the door. So if that is on the wall, the screening policy, let's say the screening policy says you need 2 consecutive pay stubs to show. Somebody looks up and they don't have a job, they're going to see what they need and they're going to see they don't have that. They may go ahead and walk out the door and not actually be denied.
Sure.
I have a lot of people that say they don't want to be rejected. And you don't get into the project of, did you reject them based upon this or that? They walked out the door because they saw what your screening policy was.
Yeah, they self-selected out.
Right. And then the 4th policy is the one that really is right now the big bugaboo in all of housing. Of course, that's the one for reasonable accommodation and reasonable modification. And for all your listeners that probably called in today, it's the one that everybody wants to know about. Okay, it's, a reasonable accommodation is making sure that that you have a dedicated parking space to somebody who's handicapped, but it's also the one that tenants come in and talk about when they're interested in having a reasonable accommodation for the ever popular service animal.
Yes.
And that's the one that everybody's right now is getting on. That somebody walks into the main office, and of course their pet Burmese python is needed to help them with their depression.
Yes.
And so what is important in this is that you have a policy in place as a landlord that says request for accommodation and modification of our existing policies. We have a no pet policy. You want to request that you have a modification or an accommodation to that under the law. Here is how we go about doing it. Here is the form that we request that you have filled out by your healthcare professional, who tells us whether or not you need this animal as a part of your treatment for whatever instance of health problem you might have. Now, mind you, don't ask them about the health problem.
Okay.
But you can give the doctor, or give them a form to take to their doctor, nurse, or healthcare professional to fill out to say, this Burmese python is something that this person really needs for full enjoyment of their property. And when you have this process in place and you make it interactive with the tenant and the person that wants the accommodation, you're going to be in a much better place to either know whether or not this person actually does need an accommodation, and two, if you deny the accommodation, you're going to have all the documentation and you've been through this process to go through it.
That's, Rick, I have not heard about this form. I think what happens as a general, as a practical matter in communities is that the tenant or the prospective tenant brings in a 2-sentence letter from a healthcare provider that says this patient would benefit from having a service animal or a pet. And that's what I hear owners and managers talk about. So what would be on the questionnaire? How could a community owner access this form that you're referring to?
All you have to do is the email that I gave before, subscribe to our fair housing update. We provide that along with the sample policies that we've been talking about. We will give you sample policies that you can sit down with your attorney. Gosh, I hate to do that. I hate to actually make somebody spend money on an attorney, but this is actually a place where you should.
Sure.
Sit down with the attorney and say, here's some sample policies. I want to make sure they fit my business profile for my community. Let's make sure we have these in place. And with that, here's a form that when people come in, we're going to ask them to take back to their medical professional to sign and come forward with regards to whether or not you have whether or not you are entitled to use this animal. The one thing that it does not allow, the law does not say that when somebody goes to a website and orders a little cape for their Burmese python to put around it that says assistance python, just because they have a little cape on doesn't mean they are in fact allowed under the law as an accommodation animal. So you get to that point where you have to actually push the button. They know their rights when they come in. They've read about this stuff, but you need to know as a landlord your rights too. And you're allowed to ask not what the disease is or what the problem is, the medical problem is, but you can say, take this to your doctor, have it filled out and brought back to me.
So there's a lot of these all sound like very practical policies. The general anti-discrimination policy that refers to state, federal, and local fair housing laws, and then the reasonable accommodation, reasonable modification, the occupancy standards, and the rental screening policy. Those sound like really useful policies to have. So we will, I think it's good that people have a source where they can get this information.
We would love to have them on our mailing list because, again, we think that fair housing is good policy for the industry. When one person in one community has a bad case of fair housing, it affects the entire industry. So that's one of the reasons we do this for all people in the industry, not just our members. And we do it for free because we want people abiding by fair housing laws.
Sure. And Rick, what about, there has been some things in the paper about convicted felons or people leaving prison, and it's possible that more people will be leaving the prison system as policies or practices change both in the federal and state prison system. So is there anything that coming down the pike, or what do community owners need to know about renting to people with a criminal background?
This is very important and very fresh in what's going on in the law right now of fair housing. In April of 2016, the Department of Housing and Urban Development issued a new guidance on how the fair housing law applies to the use of a criminal history check for housing providers. Very important that your community owners out in Iowa take a look at this and realize what's going on. It goes back to the policies. In the screening policies that you're allowed to have, HUD has said, based upon the statistical instances of minorities being arrested and not convicted, that asking someone on a form, have you ever been arrested, is a violation of fair housing law. Now, this doesn't make criminals a protected class. What this means is that in your policy, you have to say on the screening side, we will, as Rick's community in Des Moines, Iowa, we will screen for convictions within a certain amount of time of your application that have an important impact on the safety and soundness of our community. So, and I would go so far in those as to list what we're talking about. We're talking about crimes of violence, crimes of sexual predator, those types of drug dealing, those types of issues. I always use the example when I'm teaching this class. If you have someone walk through the door who was convicted of tax evasion 25 years ago, is that something that you should be allowed to screen upon? The answer is no. If someone was convicted 3 years ago of a violent crime or of drug dealing, is that something you can screen upon, whether they're a protected class or not? The answer is yes.
Okay.
So those are the type of things to think about, but you have to remember this. We're talking about convictions, not arrest. If you have on your policy and if you have on your application form, have you ever been arrested? Take a magic marker right now, take that Sharpie and X that question out. Don't ever ask it again. Find yourself a new form.
Okay.
Have you ever been convicted? Tell me of all your convictions within the last, and some people differ on this, whether they want it to be 3 or 5 years. I would pick one of those and go with it. Tell me what you've been convicted of.
Okay. Okay.
And then you have to have that policy in place that says we will screen based upon convictions that have an impact on the safety and soundness of the residents of our community.
Okay.
Including but not limited to acts of violence, selling drugs, sexual predatory nature, any of those types of documents that you then talk about. Those are incidents you talk about. That's what we want to screen based upon.
Well, that sounds like that's a very good explanation of what community owners can do to be in compliance with the spirit of this policy.
Right, and it's a very important guidance, and I would suggest all people take a look at it. When it first came out, people thought, "Oh, we've made criminals a protected class." No, we haven't. We're changing the paradigm on what we have to ask when people walk in the door, and it's not "Have you ever been arrested?" It's "Have you ever been convicted?"
Yes, and what about here in Cedar Rapids, this never actually passed, but the city council wanted to hold the landlords responsible for crimes committed on the property. In other words, making it the landlord's responsibility if the tenant committed a crime. So just to get the landlords to get more involved with how people were behaving on the property. Are you seeing anything like that coming down the pike?
There is a push for that in certain areas, and the one place where you find that is in spousal and domestic abuse. There are people out there who, through the Uniform Landlord-Tenant Act and other of those uniform acts, are trying to make the landlord more responsible as being someone who chooses sides on who the winner and loser is. We were able, in fact, actually to get something struck out of the Uniform Landlord-Tenant Act by going down to their meeting and talking about it on how horrible of a decision this was, and in fact put the landlord in a liability situation where they shouldn't be and should be putting the police officers instead and local law enforcement authorities. So there is a move by some folks, and it's because of concern about some of those domestic violence issues that I see a lot of it coming. It is something you have to be vigilant to look out for, because it's where it will creep up is in city ordinances.
Sure. So it just, really speaks to landlords being more cognizant or vigilant about what's happening on their properties and trying to work more with their tenants when they learn about these things, so that they don't become federal cases or even a local case. And
that's
so,
right. Federal
oh, go ahead.
Federal, and the one thing I would add is that federal and local cases come about in large part right now because the testers that are out there who have local agencies or involved with fair housing associations are out there testing right now. And if you think it's only people walking through the door, it's not. It's people calling you on the phone. It's people doing everything they can to try and do something. And as I tell everybody with regards to this topic, treat everybody that walks through the door, treat everybody that calls your office, your main office, calls you at home even, treat everyone like they are a tester. And I would even say that owners and operators should self-test. I think they should try and pick up the phone and see if they can catch their own people in their front office doing this. Now, I said this at a conference one day, and a good friend of mine from Texas came up to me afterwards and said, "Hey, man, will you call my wife and see if you can slip her up on this fair housing stuff?" And I said, "Sean, I'm afraid of your wife. I know your wife. I'm afraid of her. I'm not going to try and do this on the phone. You can try that yourself, but I'm not going to be the one to get your wife mad at me." But I would say that I think that's very important, to make sure that you have training with your staff. And when I say training with your staff, I mean everybody from the folks in the front office to the people that cut the grass. Because the people who cut the grass can say obnoxious things just as easy as somebody in the front office. And I think you want to make sure when you do your training, you train all employees, and you make sure everybody in the organization knows your commitment to fair housing.
I think that's an excellent point. We're getting towards the end of this show, and so I think that is a very key point, is to treat everybody as if they're a tester. Well, I want to, before we conclude this call, Rick, I would like to ask you, I know when you spoke at the Iowa Association a few years ago, and one of the things I remember you said was that you could, I want you to tell our listeners how to say Louisville in one syllable. I'm still practicing that, and I don't think I've mastered it yet. So can you, share that with us?
Every year at the Kentucky Derby, you can tell the folks from out of town because they say they're in Louisville, Louisville. You can tell the folks who are from home because they say Louisville.
Okay.
Louisville, just all strung together. There's no break. Sounds like two syllables, but all just runs together there in Louisville.
Well, that's a fun way to end this call, but this is a quite serious topic, and these are very valuable ideas. And so Rick's, this call has been recorded, and it will be in our YouTube channel, along with Rick's contact information to sign up for the newsletter that he does on federal fair housing. I want to thank Rick for being our guest today and the very valuable information. And next Thursday, I will be interviewing Gene Doback of Triad Financial, and he's going to share with us some new financing available for the consumers. So you don't want to miss that. And thank you again, Rick.
Joanne, I enjoyed it very much. Look forward to seeing you in Iowa in a couple months.
Sounds good. So long, everybody. See you next week.